So, Greenpeace is highly professional now, with every action well planned, every campaigner well trained, but it wasn't always like that. We survived the early days on luck, as well as inspiration and heartfelt effort. What you're going to hear, or what I'd like to give you today, is an unvarnished account of how we got from 1971 up until the present day. It all started with a bang in 1969.
Can I just say that you are John Frizell?
Oh yeah, you can say that. Yeah. Sorry, I'm John Frizell, and I'm the former international executive director of Greenpeace when it was in Lewes. So for the 6 years when the Greenpeace world headquarters was in Temple House, I was running the show. So, well, actually, David McTaggart was really running the show, but he sometimes let me believe I was. So, like I say, it started with a bang when the Americans set off a nuclear bomb under a remote island off Alaska. Now, this coming Wednesday is the 80th anniversary of the first use of a nuclear weapon against people. The one the Americans set off in 1969 was 80 times more powerful than the one that devastated Hiroshima. Canadians on the West Coast were worried because the area has earthquake fault lines. It's known as the Pacific Ring of Fire. Bob Hunter, Vancouver-based journalist, raised the specter of a tsunami. The test went off without incident, but the announcement of another test to be done at Amchitka Island in 1971, 400 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb, led to the formation of the Don't Make a Wave Committee, a group of environmental activists and hippies. The name Greenpeace was coined at one of its meetings when leaving someone said, "Peace," someone else said, "Make it a green piece." And there was the name. So the group decided to sail to Amchitka to protest the test. Their first problem was money. Joni Mitchell stepped up and together with James Taylor did a benefit concert in Vancouver that raised $16,000. If it weren't for her, I doubt there'd been a Greenpeace story for me to tell you today. So the committee headed for the docks and made their pitch. "We'd like to hire you for a month to sail 1,500 miles north, stop as close to a nuclear test as you can get, and wait for the bomb to go off." Right? Exactly. It wasn't an easy sell. Finally, they found John Cormack, who said he would do it, but it would cost $10,000 a month, and it would take 6 weeks, so $15,000. They accepted his offer on the spot. Years later, I asked John why he did it. He said he knew nothing of the concert. He thought they were just penniless hippies and expected them to walk away when he named the price. So John's 80-foot halibut seiner, the Phyllis Cormack, was soon packed with hippies and environmentalists, an abiding love for nature, but little or no experience at sea. So John drove some basics into them, one of which was steering. It's not hard. You're given a course, which is a number between 0 and 360. You stand behind the wheel, watch the compass, point the bow so it's aligned with the correct course reading on the compass. What could possibly go wrong? So, one of the hippies had the 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. wheel walk. He liked a bit of music in the cold, lonely darkness. So he brought his reel-to-reel tape recorder and set it on the only flat surface in the bridge, which was beside the compass. The compass promptly swiveled 25 degrees and stayed that way while he was on watch, throwing a kink into the course. It bothered John, couldn't understand why his dead reckoning wasn't working, and it confused the Americans who had trouble locating the ship. The media ran stories about how the clever environmentalists were bamboozling the Americans with secret tactics, but it didn't last. The Phyllis Cormack was intercepted by the U.S. Coast Guard. The nuclear test was delayed. As Greenpeace waited, they were arrested and fined by the Coast Guard, but received a letter of support from the sailors who arrested them, who basically said, "We have to do our duty, but we think you're right." So after the arrest, the crew, having no idea when the test would be held, decided to return to Vancouver. The return voyage was pretty glum, with them thinking themselves failures, but their support from the crew of the Coast Guard ship and the story of their arduous journey swept the media, generating widespread support and money. They chartered a larger ship and went north again. They were 1 day away from Amchitka when the Americans moved the test up by a day and detonated the bomb. The U.S. canceled further tests. A few months later, the Don't Make a Wave Committee became the Greenpeace Foundation. So the next year, in 1972, Greenpeace turned its attention to the South Pacific and the remote atoll of Mururoa, where France was setting off nuclear bombs in the atmosphere. There were difficulties. Moreau is in the opposite hemisphere from Vancouver. It's hard to reach. They didn't have a boat. They didn't have much money. So they put out a call for anyone in the area with a boat who would be willing to make the trip. Their call was answered by David McTaggart, a fellow Canadian, also from Vancouver. David didn't actually care very much about nuclear testing, but he was incensed the French were cordoning off an area of the high seas in violation of international law, and he saw it as an attack on his personal freedom. He offered to go, but Greenpeace paid his expenses and provided him with a long-range radio. So the trip in the Vega, his 38-foot sailboat, was long and beset with heavy weather, and on arrival, the exhausted crew had to play mouse and cat with the French Navy for 3 weeks, constantly maneuvering into position downwind of the test site until the French, running behind schedule, lost patience and rammed them. With the Vega crippled and unable to sail home, they had to put into the French base for emergency repairs. The problem was the long-range radio had long since stopped working, so the crew had no way to tell their story, and the only voice to be heard by the world was that of the French government, saying the Vega had caused the collision by bad maneuvering, and they had rescued the protesters from their own incompetence. David and his crew went back home to tell the true story. 3 years later, a French court found the collision had been caused by their navy and awarded damages for the full cost of repairs. I think Martin will be telling you a bit about that later. In 1973, the Vega returned to Mururoa, and this time it was worse. The crew made a much quicker passage to Mururoa. The day after their arrival, French Navy commandos boarded the Vega illegally in international waters and beat up the crew, inflicting a serious eye injury on McTaggart. One of the crew took pictures, scuttled below, put out a decoy camera, and hid the film she'd just taken. McTaggart needed days of hospital treatment. Meanwhile, the French authorities announced their boarding party had been unarmed and he had injured his eye by falling on a deck cleat. Once McTaggart was safely on his way home, the pictures were released, showing the boarding party beating him with truncheons. The unraveling of the French lies made headlines around the world. 3 months later, France ended atmospheric testing and moved to testing underground. Meanwhile, Bob Hunter and the others were thinking about the green side of Greenpeace and launched Project Ahab, a campaign to end whaling. In 1975, Phyllis Cormack sailed again, carrying a crew of hippies and mystics, prepared to put themselves between the harpoon and the whale. They sailed most of the way to Alaska, playing music to whales, sometimes guided by casts of the I-Ching, but saw no sign of the whaling fleet. An orca scientist named Paul Spong visited the International Whaling Commission's Central Records Office and came away with decades of Russian whaling records. The Greenpeace crew had been looking in the wrong place. They found the Russian whalers 1,000 miles to the south, 60 miles off California. This was in the days before the 200-mile limits. So then the human shields, 2-man crews and outboard-powered inflatables swung into action. A 16-foot inflatable carrying Bob Hunter took up station in front of a towering 180-foot capture as it closed in on a sperm whale. The little boat's engine began to sputter and die. The driver put the fuel tank on top of the fuel line and couldn't figure out what was wrong. Bob transferred to another inflatable and took up position. The cameraman in the third inflatable swung his camera into position, framed the shot, pressed the button. Nothing happened. He struggled with the camera. It started running. It was an enormous bang. The harpoon flew through the camera's field of view over the inflatable with Hunter in it and struck the fleeing sperm whale. The resulting film clip went around the world and catapulted Greenpeace to a fame it had never known before. Everywhere the ship docked on the U.S. West Coast, the Greenpeace office sprung up. 2 years later, in 1977, I was doing logistics for the Greenpeace anti-sealing campaign at our base camp on a windswept island north of Newfoundland, misleadingly named Belle Isle, where winter lasts most of the year. I had occasion to wish I'd paid more attention in French class when Brigitte Bardot helicoptered out to meet us. So sitting around, not able to understand a word or say a word. So much for bilingualism in Canada. By then, it wasn't just the Canadian and American Greenpeace offices working against whaling and sealing. European Greenpeace offices were as well, and they took a different approach to logistics. In North America, the Greenpeace office chartered ships for their campaigns. In Europe, they bought one. An old trawler became the Rainbow Warrior, and by 1978 she was confronting Icelandic whalers. While all this was happening, schisms were opening in the world of Greenpeace. The financial success of the Americans irked the Canadians, especially since they were $160,000 in debt, while the Americans were rolling in cash and spending it on campaign work as they saw fit. The Vancouver office filed a lawsuit against the San Francisco office to establish they were owners of the Greenpeace name and entitled to all money collected in the name of Greenpeace. The suit was called Greenpeace versus Greenpeace. McTaggart brokered a deal to end the lawsuit. The other groups would pay off Vancouver's debt, and no one office would own the name. Instead, all national offices, including those in Europe, would become voting members in one international body which would own the name. Greenpeace International was born, and we all got back to work. So direct action confrontation worked, and the public recognition of the plight of the whale skyrocketed. Millions of people signed petitions calling for an end to whaling, but it made no difference. Whaling carried on around the world. We attended meetings of the International Whaling Commission and discovered why. It was an industry body, a whalers club created by whaling nations, and its national delegations had just one objective: to secure the highest possible quotas for themselves. Now, there were some ex-whaling nations, like the UK and the US, who supported conservation, but they were easily outvoted by the whalers. Raising public outrage wasn't enough. We needed to find the people responsible for it, find the people responsible for instructing the national delegations and focus the public outrage on them. Not easy when the delegations come from places like Russia, Korea, Japan, Norway, and Iceland, and the outrage comes from places like the UK and the US. So in 1980, David McTaggart, working with Sir Peter Scott of the World Wildlife Fund, came up with a different way: find as many conservation-minded countries as possible and encourage them to join the club. The 1981 IWC meeting agreed a moratorium on catching sperm whales. The 1982 meeting agreed a moratorium on catching all whales. The will of the world had finally triumphed. And Greenpeace continued to thrive, using growing support to expand into new areas of environmental protection. By early 1985, we had a ship in the Antarctic and were preparing to build a base there to stop plans to start mining in that last wilderness. We had people coming to Temple House with plans for the base, not just sketches, but actually, construction drawings, timbers and bolts and the whole thing. And we won. 6 years later, we won a 50-year ban on mining, and we did something I think nobody working in Antarctica has ever done before. We dismantled the whole base and took it back out, leaving the area pristine. Well, so it was July the 10th, 1985. I was attending a Greenpeace International board meeting, and the phone rang with a collect call from New Zealand for McTaggart. He took the call, didn't say a word for 2 minutes, then put the phone down. The Rainbow Warrior's been sunk, he said. 2 explosions. 2 crew members were missing. One was soon found safe. The other was dead, trapped between decks. 2 of the French agents responsible were caught as they attempted to leave. Now, in movies, secret agents just dump their vehicles, but these 2 decided to get a refund on the rental deposit rate. So there is some suspicion. There's 2 explanations for this. One is the French were very tough on expenses, and and the other was that they were basically fiddling their expenses and they wanted to pocket that money. Well, we don't know which. But in any case, the arrest opened a trail leading back to the French Minister of Defense, who was forced to resign. We sued France, and our lawyer's closing comment was, remember, you can't sink a rainbow without paying actual, aggravated, and exemplary damages. So we won and used part of the $8 million settlement to build a new Rainbow Warrior, converting another old trawler into a sail-assisted campaign vessel. She served for 22 years, and on retirement was given to a medical charity to become a hospital ship. The replacement, built in 2011, is the first environmental campaign vessel to be purpose-built from the keel up, and carries a helicopter as well as inflatables. She's currently at sea under sail on her way to Panama. You can't sink a rainbow. And now my friend and colleague Martin.
Yes, I will in a moment. However, what John knows, and I thought he was going to say and didn't, is why Greenpeace International came to be here. And it's embedded in that story, which is that the 1982 edition of the International Whaling Commission took place in Brighton. They take place in weird places. I went to one in Bournemouth.
Yeah, they did 3 years in a row in Brighton.
Oh, right. Okay, so when they did that, and they actually got the moratorium on commercial whaling in 1982, McTaggart had to spend a lot of time in and around Brighton and East Sussex. And he just received an advance on the first of one of his very many autobiographies. He had almost as many autobiographies as he had wives, and more than he had children. But anyway, during his time in Brighton, he became acquainted with Rodmell, a nice village previously home to the Virginia Woolf and Leonard Woolf. Thought this was a nice place, and as far as I'm aware, put a deposit down on Rose Cottage, which must still exist there, and which had a big barn. At the same time, what was then Greenpeace International office was intending to move from Amsterdam to Geneva. So they put all the files and everything in a van or lorry and drove it to Geneva. They hadn't counted on the Swiss, and when they got to the Swiss frontier, the Swiss said, "And who the hell are you?" And they said, "Well, we're Greenpeace, and this is our files, and we're just moving to set up shop, like all proper international organizations in Geneva." And the Swiss said, "Oh no, you're not." So they rang McTaggart, who was in Rodmell, and said, "What do we do? We've got this lorry of stuff. We're outside, we're in, Ferny Voltaire, probably, I suppose, on the French side of the Swiss border. What are we going to do?" And he said, "Oh shit, well look, the easiest thing to do is just turn the van around, or the lorry around, drive to Dieppe, get on the 4.5 ferry from Dieppe to New Haven, go up the C7, and third on the left is Rodmell, or on the right actually, if you're coming from New Haven, go down there, find it, and shove all the crap, including the truck, in my barn, and then we'll sort it out." So this was late 82.
Yeah, it was late 82, yeah.
And so that's how it got here, and then they sort of looked around and they came up with all this bullshit about how it was close to a major port, close to a major airport, fair enough, Gatwick, and that it was nice and it had a radical tradition and all this. It's all bullshit. Okay? It's just a complete accident as described by the Swiss border guards. So that's why it's here, and nothing to do with Thomas Paine or anybody.
And that's also why I'm here, because once it was there, we thought, well, we need somebody to run it. So at that point, I was living in Honolulu, in Hawaii, and he said, "Come on over." I said, "Well, it's not quite the same." And he instructed the staff not to tell me anything about the weather. And I accepted to come for 3 years, and that was in 1983.
Yeah, that's also why I'm here. So anyway, I'm now going to revert to what I was going to say in the first place. I'm Martin Leeburn, and first thing to do is correct some misinformation that's been put out by in ignorance, that this is the 50th anniversary, 2025, of something. Well, it's obviously the anniversary of something, but it's got no anniversary of to do with Greenpeace in Lewes, and we try to correct this, but to no avail. So that stupid error persists in some cases. In 1974, I was a Reuters correspondent in Paris. I was the baby in the office, and the boss gave me a job. Well, we all had continuing jobs throughout the day. But he said, oh, this might make a feature. There's some Canadian lunatic suing the French government for piracy on the high seas. Get to know him, find out if there's anything in it. It might be a story. And this is 1974. So I met McTaggart, and we had a few drinks, and we'd go out for dinner and blah, blah. And got on very well. And he briefed me about his story, which went rumbling through the French courts and continued to rumble until, as John has already described, the 17th of June 1975, when you could pass that round. There's McTaggart and me, but it really is me. And the blonde woman in the back is Anne-Marie Horn, who was the heroic crew member on the Vega who hid I won't say where, she hid the camera, the roll of film that she took of McTaggart being beaten up, and which they later used to prove the French were lying. So it is the 50th anniversary but of nothing else. But I can assure you at that time, McTaggart had never heard of Lewes. So anyway, the story came out, I filed the story. I was the only person who'd been following it because all the very many bigwig Canadian correspondents in Paris couldn't be bothered with McTaggart. But when the story hit the wires, their papers at home got onto them, and everybody was chasing after McTaggart. So I was able to say, well, this is his number, this is the story, blah, 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 blah. So you got a lot of publicity in Canada at that time on the back of the story, which was, and we became and remain firm friends. That was in June 1975. 10 years later, I was working for Foreign News in the BBC. The Rainbow Warrior was sunk. Greenpeace announced that they were going to send another ship to Mururoa, the MV Greenpeace. And the BBC thought it'd be rather fun to get a reporter on the ship. So this came up in one of the meetings, and I said, well, I know McTaggart, I'll ring McTaggart. So I rang McTaggart, and I said, oh, can we do this? He said, yeah, if you can get someone to the Pacific coast of Panama in 2 days' time, he's on the ship. So my late friend Bob Simpson was dispatched to Panama. He got on the ship. Nothing whatsoever happened. I don't think the ship ever went anywhere near Mururoa. And when it got to Sydney, Bob had an expenses paid month-long holiday with his family. But me and McTaggart had got back in contact with one another, and he was a legendarily persuasive bloke. So I ended up working for Greenpeace International for 4 years. And it was a very interesting time. I thought I'd do something which you probably wouldn't expect, which is to talk about technology at the time, because technology, in my view, was the key of a large part of the key reasons for the success of Greenpeace at the time, and continuing success. I don't know, and technology has changed so much, I wouldn't like to say. But certainly, when I joined Greenpeace, I mean, the technology in it, Greenpeace's use of all kinds of technology was better than any other NGO on the planet, without a doubt. Better than almost any corporation, and better than some governments. And when we were doing things, I mean, I don't think a lot of governments even knew you could do, and more so as that went on. And I don't really know why this was that everybody was so into the technology. There's a certain West Coast hippiedom about it, and everybody was pretty young and very, as kids are now, young people now, very into their phones and things like that. And at the time, the big coming thing was computers, and I'll know more about that in a moment. Also, there were a lot of people involved in Greenpeace at the time. Some in Europe, most of them on the West Coast, whether that was in British Columbia or California or indeed Oregon, who could have been easily billionaires in Apple or Microsoft if they hadn't been such awkward bastards. And we've all read stories about the early days of Microsoft and Steve Jobs and everything, but they were awkward But I mean, some of these people really were prize winners, and they were, you know, there were some people that were such square pegs there was no round hole in California to which they would fit. So what am I going to do with this? And they would turn to Greenpeace in large part. Well, I say large part. I mean, there were enough of them to do it. And so the world, although we didn't really know it, I mean, some of these geniuses probably did, that the world was on the cusp of a change from analog to digital. And Greenpeace got that before really anybody else did. So a little bit about what the international media was like 40 odd years ago. I mean, there was no internet, no mobile phones. I say no internet, I mean, insofar as anybody had anything like the internet, we did. Greenpeace did. And no mobile phones, although we were very early adopters of that. All the boats had, ships had Inmarsat phones on, which work off these geostationary satellites, a bit like Starlink. And they existed then, and certainly all the ships, which I don't think you were obliged to, really. You weren't obliged to have an Inmarsat phone. I think you are now.
Yeah, I mean, now you're obliged to carry a beacon saying where you are, which most of them turn off once they're out of national waters anyway.
Yeah, and print media were very important. You know, I don't know when any of you last bought a magazine or a newspaper and read it. You know, those were the days, and that was why agencies like Reuters and so on existed, to feed that. Photographs taken on film, which these are here, were also very important to go into the hard copy print media which people bought because of the advertising and waiting there. TV was the 4-5 terrestrials, that was it. Satellite TV was CNN in its infancy, which had some impact in the flat unoccupied places, bits of America. And cable TV, condos in New York. Other than that, forget it, didn't exist. There were 4 international news agencies. There were Reuters, Associated Press, United Press International, Associated Press. Obviously in the Soviet Union, agencies like TASS existed, but they were pointless from the point of view of Greenpeace because there was no public opinion that you could influence, no democracy. You've all seen what's happened to that. And there was a brief, as you'll see from some of these posters, sort of idea that Russia would fundamentally change, which we had big arguments about. I was right. Unfortunately. But that's not to say that, you know, there weren't a lot of good people who fought a good cause. There were 2 international television news agencies, and this was the most important thing really. There was Viz News, which was kind of Reuters for television, and UPITN, which is a mixture of United Press International and ITN, Independent Television News in London. And Greenpeace always wanted to get the maximum exposure for everything that it did, and it only did things when it was guaranteed that it would get exposure. There was no point doing some whale action in the Pacific if no one was going to be aware that you'd done it. It really was Marshall McLuhan, you know, the medium is the message. And that was the idea from the beginning. As far as I'm aware, and it was certainly the idea when I joined it. The news system compared to now, I say system, was unbelievably rigid compared to what you have now. There were kind of rules about what you could do, what was an accepted source, what was not an accepted source. It wasn't the chaos that you get now with TikTok and Instagram. So I have no idea how people in my then position now deal with all this stuff, because everybody's a bloody journalist, everybody's a photographer, everybody's making a film, and how you make your thing stand out I have absolutely no idea how you do that. I mean, you can build up millions and millions of followers, I suppose, but that is not a given. You have to work to do that. And a very good example, I was reminded of this the other day, of the rigidity and the force, the strength, power of the media system then was Live Aid. I mean, that was all Michael Burke, News at 10, BBC News at 9, I think it was at the time actually. But anyway, it was Michael Burke, one news report from Ethiopia, and then 6 months later you had Live Aid, which was 3 days before the Rainbow Warrior got sunk. At the same time, you had the Bhopal disaster in India, Chernobyl. Those things coincided with this very rigid and exploitable by, if you knew what you were doing, system of getting news into people's heads. I say if you knew what you were doing, you had to use compatible technology. You couldn't sort of turn up with some amateur shit and say, oh, how about this? They say, no, I'm sorry. This is the BBC, or this is ITN, or CBS, or whatever it is. You had to be absolutely on the money with the highest possible standards, to sometimes ridiculous extent, as you'll hear. The strongest partners for Greenpeace were Viz News for TV news, and for news photos, AP, Associated Press. When I started in 1986, the communication department technical officers were in Canary Wharf before they built Canary Wharf. So we got the worst of every possible world. They knocked everything down and built nothing. There was not even a pub you could go to. But it was cheap. And the chief cameraman there was a guy called Tony Mariner, who was a very great man. And he would spend lunchtimes explaining to the rest of us that worked there what was the difference between Todd AO, on which they shot, as you all know, they shot The Sound of Music on Todd AO, and Panavision, which is what they shot most of Ben-Hur on. And it's all to do with lenses and projectors and pull-down ratios and all this stuff. And there was the book, The American Cinematographer Manual, on the table. And everybody had to be aware that we worked to that. There was sort of, it may sound mad, but there was a message to it, because the definition in film is molecular, which is why you can take something the size of a positive image, a slide, the size of a postage stamp, and you can project it on a wall 100 yards away, and it still looks like life. And in a world of different standards, broadcast and changing standards, the one thing that was solid, steady, was film. So we shot everything on 16mm film, sometimes on what they call reversal, which means it comes out positive, not negative, so it cuts down the staging process. And Tony, we used to argue like hell about this, because I wanted to move quicker to tape, and he had all these very good reasons about why you shouldn't move to tape, because a lot of the tape origination was utterly shit, and I had to sort of bow to his superior knowledge, because it was rumoured that he'd shot the Steadicam footage on Full Metal Jacket. I mean, which was shot just around the corner from Canary Wharf, incidentally, and there was anything ever shot in Vietnam. But I mean, he was that good. Is that good. So we couldn't afford for anybody to think we were hippie dipsticks. So when we dealt with anybody, we'd say, yeah, it will be there. It's shot on this. The cameraman is so-and-so, who, by the way, worked for you last week. Which, because there were a lot of freelance cameramen who worked for ITN and BBC, and freelance still photographers, who we employed deliberately exactly the same people. And we had an arrangement with Viz News, thanks to Tony, where if we shot an action anywhere in the world, we would deliver the original material, mostly on film. on colour reversal 16mm film to the Viz News agent in a particular place, whether it was India or we didn't do much in India really, but in Australia or anywhere in Europe or United or North America, and they would take it as if it was theirs, and they'd cut it into a news story. And in Europe, the key things are the Eurovision news exchanges, which go for, there's 4 now, then there were 3. They do one in about 10 o'clock in the morning for the lunchtime news, they do in about 4 o'clock in the afternoon for the early evening news, and then one more 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock for the later evening news. And so our stuff, if we'd done something in Stockholm that morning, it would certainly, at the very latest, be on the Eurovision link at 6. And it would be offered up. It cost Viz News nothing to do it. Stuff came in the door, they processed it, cut it together, put it up. Either it would get news or it wouldn't get news. And they're pictures. There's no one saying anything. It's just pictures. So it's not, as you might, if you listen to the radio and hear anything about Gaza in the morning, there's continuing shouting matches between people about who says what, and you balance and who says this and who says the other. Well, of course, this is just pictures. I mean, look, you can see bloody happening, man. And sometimes they would be irresistible. I mean, people, they'd be like sort of Pavlovian dogs, these news editors. They couldn't resist it. They'd say, Christ. And they'd put it on. They wouldn't, they'd write some vague cue and then just show the amazing footage of some bloke jumping off a smokestack somewhere. So anyway, these days you could do it with Bluetooth. Then it was much more complicated. The archives are all over the world, and one of the things I had to do was to try and get some of the archive back from Vancouver, where a guy called Michael Chetchik looked after it. And then we decided that it was actually better off in Vancouver, because even if they blew up Canary Wharf, as they had done with the Rainbow Warrior, they wouldn't think to go to Vancouver and blow that up. So I don't know, it may even still be there. And eventually we moved to tape. Although, with one exception, the old American broadcast television standard was called NTSC, known in the trade as never the same colour. And if you remember, not the kind of TV we got now, but I mean, when BBC Two first came on, it was 625 lines. PAL 625 was a German television system. NTSC's got 525 lines. Even the first generation NTSC looks like shit. Once you transfer it to any other kind of format, then you're not very far off cataracts. Really, 3 or 4, and it's what? Is that a wave? So that's why we stuck as long as we could. But then rapidly the digital format's gotten better. It was also very important for us to produce good colour still images. And this is, I have to check this. The first newspaper to print all colour was 1986. Today, a bloke called Sharp, Eddie Sharp, produced Today. And by all colour, I mean they had colour photos in it. Before 1986, everything was black and white. And that was the year, 1986, that Rupert Murdoch started printing the Sunday Times in Wapping. And we know what happened then. And in fact, Murdoch bought Today in 1995 and closed it. But what I was saying about the TV footage was the same as with the black and white and colour footage, the still footage that we have. Colour was great for magazines. It was then, it's the same thing now. If you used to take happy snaps on your holidays and take them down to Boots, C41, big yellow machine that they had in the back next to the Volunteer, which my daughter used to run. You put them in there and it would automatically produce the slides or the or the negatives, depending on which system, which button you pressed. It's the same system now. It's the same stuff in the films as they shot Ben-Hur on, chemically. So it was really, really important. London was a very bad place at the time in the late 80s to be doing anything to do with high quality photos. For some reason, the support services were shit. Paris was really good because there was a French tradition of photojournalism with agencies like Gamma and Magnum, which were based in Paris, which had really high quality technical people who could duplicate slides and send them around and duplicate other photo things. But obviously Paris wasn't ideal for sending off our kit to get done in the light of recent circumstances. So this wasn't great, and it was very expensive and not very good in London until step forward this bloke called John Norris, later head of photos for Greenpeace, who worked out how to do it, how to copy slides. Believe me, this is unbelievably difficult. We needed at least 20 copies of every decent slide. And John worked out a way of doing it. You're basically taking a photograph of a photograph, but slightly more to it than that. And he got it so good that even our German office couldn't tell the originals from the copies. And that was, it's like the forged papers in a war film trying to get on. And I have here a print done by John Norris, which I'll pass around in a minute, because there's something else I need to say about what he used to do, which was centered around the black and white photos, which went into colour, into the newspapers that weren't printed in colour. And we had a very close relationship with AP, Associated Press. We bought from them things like very, very high quality faxes, which we put on the ships. By the end of my time, all the ships had dark rooms and AP wire photo machines. And you could take a photo anywhere and you could send it off the ship. And this photo, not this actual photo, but a version of that photo was sent from Antarctica, and that was published in the Guardian, and it's taken at a French site called Duval-Durville, where they were making insanely an airport in a penguin colony. You think, Jesus Christ, what are these people doing? And that was taken by a bloke called Steve Morgan, who went back to the ship, developed his black and white photo, printed it, put it on the AP machine, and it was in at least the Guardian and probably a lot of other places after that. And we were very good customers of AP. They loved us and we loved them. Now, let's talk about computers. Anybody remember floppy disks? Man back there does. Well, floppy disks, it was like a computer, but you had one hole that you put your floppy thing with the program on it, and another hole with the data, with another floppy in. And we had those everywhere, but we had lots of them. And we had these guys who would have been millionaires in Microsoft or Apple, who were working on this stuff, and modems and so on. And when I got there in 1986, the whole international thing ran on email. Now, no one else, well, I say no one else, very few other people had email. We had bloody email. And so you could work on something in the day. If you're working on a proposal with someone in New Zealand, or for that matter San Francisco, you could write you could knock it off at the end of your working day, ping it off to there, come back the next day and pick up the changes, and then very, very quickly you'd have a perfectly reasoned and discussed and agreed draft that you could put forward to the next funding meeting or whatever it was. And we standardized Anybody remember Word Perfect? Lots of fans of Word Perfect. It still exists, as mainly in the legal profession, I understand. But we then standardised on Word by diktat of this guy in California who was one of the potential billionaires, Dick Dillman, who's still going strong. And Dick was very generous with the environmental movement, and he built 2 different communications networks, one of which was kind of open to anybody in the American environmental movement, including the Sierra Club and people, and one of which was for Greenpeace. And we at the International didn't know quite where one end and the other did started. So I went out to San Francisco to sort of try and sort this out with Dick. And we ended up with a Greenpeace system, which was a Greenpeace system. I'm not sure you could do attachments on it, but you could certainly cut and paste huge documents into the bodies of the text. And the other system went to the American environmental movement. I mean, you know what this is. He sent a telex over shortwave once, ship to ship or ship to shore, which apparently is difficult. Or was it you that did that?
Dick did that was radio teletype, so that's easy if you happen to be an electronics genius or a keen radio man like Dick was.
Yes, exactly.
The system he made for us was called Comet. Remember that?
That's it, Comet.
Yeah.
That's
and
it. Yes.
Because there had been a big comet around that time.
Yeah.
And after a while, it had this handy little add-on he added to it, was that you could send to an external thing called the internet. So you could actually send a message, like Comet was a closed system, but you could send out to the internet and they could send stuff back to you. They just couldn't actually get into Comet itself.
Yeah, that's it, Comet. So all this, anyway, it all evolved very, very quickly with some really very sort of like world's sharpest people on it, and other people who were just users. But if there was someone said, "Oh, this new Radio Shack modem is the bee's knees," everybody would have them within weeks. And then somebody said, "No, it's a better one now," and everybody would have that. Well, we used to churn out huge piles of junk, but it did mean that the system evolved very quickly, and very few other people were doing this. It was a system built by users and their experience from the ground up, whereas the classic corporate use of computer networks is to build something only the seller understands. Only they can fix it, only they can evolve it. And this is Fujitsu's horizon. Welcome to the party. Whereas this, the Greenpeace thing, was not quite homemade. I mean, it was much more sophisticated. Not kind of homemade, but it was bloody sophisticated. By the time I left in 1990, we had talking email. So there was a very long telephone number you could ring, and Stephen Hawking or someone like him would read you your emails. And this is 1990. I can remember being in Washington Airport, and I was getting on a plane. I needed to know something. Half an hour dialing out the very long number, and then Stephen was there and said, "You've got 5 emails and this, that, and the other." I mean, most people didn't have email at all. Never mind talking email. We had another guy who was Canadian, who came into the office in Canary Wharf one day, and he said he'd had some kind of terrible accident and was housebound, and he said he could make a system that would tell us every day a digest of all mentions in print of the word Greenpeace, or any other word we particularly wanted. And I said, yeah. And he said, I've got, since my accident, I've got nothing better to do. And I said, well, fine. And he went and did, and it worked. It did. Every day you'd come to work and there would be, the Los Angeles Times has mentioned Greenpeace on page 27. How the hell he did this, I have no idea, and I didn't ask. Believe me, I didn't ask. Where he came from, he lived in BC somewhere. I can't remember his name. But he was a super bloke. So anyway, that's all about the kind of technological world and how it was different and how Greenpeace exploited it better than anybody else and better than certainly most companies and some countries. So how did all this make a difference in practice? Well, one example, do you remember the ozone layer and CFCs and all that? Was a big problem. It was like the 80s version of global warming. Arguably as serious, but appears to be sorted. Anyway, we thought that people weren't, the media, TV media around the world weren't picking it up quickly enough. So we made a kit, and me and Tony went and shot this really high quality kit that people could use or not use to make a story about it. So we went to Cambridge and we spent the British Antarctic Survey and we talked to Joe Farman who found the hole in the ozone layer. We had footage of him showing how the photospectrometer or whatever it was that found the hole in the Antarctic ozone layer worked. We went to Norway with NASA and filmed them flying a U-2 up into the stratosphere and a lot of other sophisticated photogenic stuff. We took this guy called Bob Watson, still alive, who was head of ozone for NASA at the time, and they were unbelievably helpful. Access to all this, and they gave us that animation. Remember the famous animation of the hole of the ozone layer over the South Pole? They said, any rights on this? Because there was no rights on any of our stuff. And they said, no, we'll give it to who you want. So we just put it in the kit, and then we sent it out to everybody. And there was nobody, apart from the sticker on the cassette, nothing else, no mention of Greenpeace. No reason to. I mean, it was so screamingly bloody obvious. You know, they could go and find their own experts to talk about it, and all you had to do was take a picture of someone, you know, opening a fridge and saying, problem, CFCs, ozone layer, and then they had all the library footage they wanted for nothing from us, and then they could talk to the professor of CFCs at the University of Oslo or whatever the local thing was. So that was great, and that was a bit of a breakthrough really, is to do it without any mention of Greenpeace at all, which some people in the organisation thought was crazy. But we said, no, we plaster, you know, beardy gits all over this, then they're going to think it's a hippie thing. It's not. It's life or death. Another better example possibly is in the 19th. This is close to the end. In the 1980s, there was a thing called ocean incineration, which seems unbelievable that it existed. But what this involved was a ship owned by the Waste Management Incorporated, which is like something out of a Batman movie, right? But that was the real name of it. And they had a ship called the Vulcanus II. Again, not an ideal name, really. If I'd been advising them, I'd have said, you know, Snow White or something. And what they put 4,000 litres of highly toxic liquid, including PCBs, into this thing, drove it out into the middle of the sort of, North Sea and set fire to it and burned it up, this integrated funnel in the middle of the ship. Now this looked like hell on earth, this thing, but it was allowed under the terms of the London Convention on the Pollution of the Sea. So anyway, we were obviously against this, so the Sirius, I think it was, went out to try and board this and stop it, or at least to be seen to be trying to stop it. And this is going on, you know, 100 miles off Great Yarmouth. So we go out there. As the boat arrives next to the Vulcanus, again doing its best to look like the last days of Sodom and Gomorrah. The Sirius, well, we've got the ITN, paid for ITN man filming all this. They've got the fire hoses coming, which are terrific. If you're ever running a boat and you're being boarded and you don't want it to look bad, don't use fire hoses. It looks really terrible. And there was a very winsome young German volunteer with long hair who jumped onto the handrail of the volcanoes, and she was promptly hit on the head by one of the seamen on the volcanoes and fell. And this looked awful. I mean, it was bloody dangerous because you've got two ships going like that. And she was fine, but it looked absolutely shocking. If you'd got Steven Spielberg and you paid him $2 billion and said, look, we want this thing to look like shit. Do your best, Steven. He wouldn't have come up with anything better. It was appalling. Now, the London Convention on the Pollution of the Sea was having its annual meeting in Lisbon, and ocean incineration was on the agenda. The cassette from the action went on an inflatable to Great Yarmouth and on a motorbike to Viz News in West London. It made the 6 o'clock Eurovision feed. The Portuguese guys couldn't resist the photos. I don't suppose they had any idea what it was, but they're fantastic photos, footage. So they put it on the early or late, what passes for late evening news in Portugal, which coincided with the coffee break of the London Convention on the Pollution of the Sea. So they all go out, they're all having their Portuguese coffees, and they're watching the television news, and they see this thing which looks like stage-managed horror. And then they finish the coffees, they go back in, it comes up on the agenda. And that was the end of ocean incineration. And it was all worked out by Remy Parmentier. Died last month. So that's it. So any questions?
Yeah.
But if there are any questions, I'm sure we do our best.
Yeah, sure we will.
Right.
Oh, there's a question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's really, really interesting. Can I ask, did you ever get sort of resistance to picking up your stories, as dramatic as they were? Because I've been on events with tens of thousands, if not 100,000 people on them, and when I've come home, I've not seen any coverage in the mainstream media. Do you think that's something that's changed, or do you think it's about the nature of events and the way that Greenpeace presented its stories?
No, I don't think the big crowds is not compelling television. I mean, you've got to create something. I mean, for TV news editors, it's like crack cocaine. I mean, most of it is still, I'm afraid, men in suits talking about things. Or some horrible, horrible stuff from Gaza and Ukraine. And if not them, then whatever that version of it is. So that isn't news. I mean, we never did demonstrations. Or, millions of people, millions? Give me 1 million. You could do something with 1 million. But 100,000, I mean, it's not exciting, it doesn't look like it. Whereas this stuff, you get some nasty bloke in a boiler suit beating a beautiful German girl over the head with an iron bar. You know, they cannot resist it. And that was the idea, way back from Hunter and everybody else that went through it, well, whether they do it now or not. I mean, that has changed. I mean, you saw the film about the Russian business when they were all locked up. I mean, there's some things you couldn't get away with then. And I don't think the Russian Soviet government gave a shit about the whalers at the time. They would now. They're whaling. But so I think the thing about, has something changed in the media? No. Mainstream media? Nah. I mean, it just, you can take a picture of 1 million or 2 million people and standing there with banners. That's it. What you want is, I mean, if you think of the things you really remember, some of them are really horrible.
Yeah, I mean, Bob Hunter used to speak, and this is back in the 70s, of the what he called the curve of media visibility, which is you do something unique every year, they're all on it, it's fantastic. You do it again, you get a little less coverage. You do it again, a little less. You do it again, and then they start to get negative coverage. They're tired of it, they don't want to see that. So I think that's an observation 50 years ago, and I'm afraid it's still quite accurate. They just get tired of it.
And I think there would be less point now because of the atomization of the audiences. I mean, my point about Live Aid's very serious. When Michael Burke did that thing, had an enormous impact. If he did it now, if you had Michael Burke live from Gaza, surrounded by children dying on camera, ghastly as that prospect is, it would have nothing like the effect. Because the audiences are just not there. So it was a good time to be doing it.
Thank you. So how would you do it if you were doing it now?
Well, try to find something different, a different way to put across your message, a different form of action. Something completely different. The one thing we know for sure is that repeating what worked the last time isn't going to work.
If you think of the Palestine Action thing, where they, as far as I can see, kicked down a fence and put rapidly removable red paint on the plane, which somehow seems to cost £7 million to. If it had been me, I'd have filmed them doing it. I wouldn't have bothered if there wasn't going to be footage of it. Whether anybody would have, how long they would have shown it for is another matter. So I really don't know. You'd have to think of something else. It goes to the million people question. But you could have a million.
Whether it's a question of empathy. So for me, for example, the most potent Gaza image is a mother cradling her starving child.
Yes.
Eugene Smith's picture of the woman with the Hiroshima victim in the bar. Or, for example, I can't remember his name, but there was a photographer who photographed the inside of an albatross filled with plastic. And all those things appeal to one's inner emotions, and I wonder whether something to do with that is the way forward.
I think there's an issue of human creativity, art, if you want. And you can't just say, well, the answer is go out and do some good art. Because you don't know what the good art's going to be until you've done it, So I don't think there's a kind of recipe for doing it. I think that there could be, like the bus station in Lewes, for example, take a silly, not entirely silly example. Why people who didn't want that to happen, the sale of it and all this, why they didn't do the equivalent of Khrushchev when he said to the Americans, "We will bury you," which scared the shit out of the Americans at the time. But why someone didn't say to all the political parties who had members on the planning committee of the South Downs National Park Authority, one of your people votes for this, you are dead, politically dead. Don't bother putting your names on the ballot papers. We will bury you. Now, I don't know whether that would work, but that's what I thought at the time. I was so enraged.
Question.
Hello.
Hello, thank you for super interesting talk. I have a different question. I'm interested why the international office had to move from Canada to Netherlands and why it had to leave the Netherlands going somewhere else and ending up in the UK?
Well, it was actually founded in the Netherlands, right?
I thought it was founded in Canada.
Oh no, Greenpeace was founded in Canada, but as a result of the Greenpeace versus Greenpeace lawsuit, we formed one international organization with rights to name, and that organization was formed in Amsterdam in 1979. In fact, I had the privilege of actually signing the declaration. So that's why it was in Amsterdam. Then it moved to Washington, D.C. for a while because we thought it would be a very clever political idea to get into the roots of power. That didn't work terribly well. And so we came back to Amsterdam. And then David decided big international organizations, Geneva, that's where they all are. So we're going to go to Geneva, greater prestige, greater reach, off we go. And I think you've heard the rest of the story.
Yes.
But there's something about the Dutch stichtings, that the rules, the regulations are the most beneficial. That was the way it was put
Yeah,
in.
foundation.
Yeah, that's right.
That they were the most beneficial. If you want to have any kind of thing, you really want to be a Dutch stichting. Rather than, and at the time, I mean, I completely understood it was not very convenient for me that when they moved to Amsterdam, but it was Thatcher and all that. I mean, I really think that it was a very healthy place to be.
No, that was the general feeling.
Yeah. Plus the dope was virtually legal.
Does anybody else have any questions of that?
Okay, good. Well, thank you all for coming.
Yeah.
Okay.